Okay, Wendy, to get started, I'm curious to ask before we get into to REBT. I noticed in preparing for this interview that you have authored or edited over 240 books. So
no, that's not correct.
What is it? What's the number now?
262.
Well, you need to update your website then.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, well, 262 books. How have you managed to do that? And I know you've done a lot of work on procrastination as well. So I'm just curious, what would you attribute the ability to be that effective to? Because I'm sure everybody listening to this would be curious to know that.
Well, some would say writing the same book 262 times, but if we put that aside, I think it's about being focused. When I'm in writing mode, I set myself realistic targets, a minimum of 500 words a day. I often exceed that, but I will kind of write until I've done 500 words, and then if more come, then more come. But then I just seem to be fairly organized and structured in my thinking, and and off we go.
Brilliant. And do you find by setting the bar at 500 words that seems realistic and achievable, and then anything above that as a bonus, so every day you feel like you're winning?
I'm ahead of the game. I like being ahead of the game, not being behind the game. So I always recommend that people set realistic targets to get ahead of the game.
Got you.
Because often people leave it, and then right at the end they've got about 20,000 words to write in about a day and a half. Now they often do that, which shows what the human being is capable, given the right conditions. But I don't want to structure my life like that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So yeah, everybody, if you want to publish over 262 books in your life, just write 500 words a day every day, and that'll get you there. So next, Wendy, could you tell us about your general specific approach to psychotherapy that you've taken over the years?
My general specific?
Yeah, general and specific approach.
General and specific. Well, look, I think that I see that in a way that the understandings offered by Albert Ellis, who I think, the more I kind of get to know his stuff, the more I think he was a genius, because he saw quite clearly many years ago, even before CBT had ever been dreamed of, that the role that what he called beliefs, what I call attitudes, play in the role of human disturbance and health. And so I've always been guided by that way of looking at, the way people tick, so to speak. But, and I think there is a structure to REBT, which I think is important, that's useful. But I've always been sort of guided by other ideas, the working alliance theory that's been put forward by Ed Baldwin in a paper in 1979. I've been influenced by, contributions to eclecticism, integration, and now pluralism over the years, which is really saying, look, don't take a unitary approach to helping people. Be mindful that people are different and are going to require different approaches. And I've been really kind of influenced by that. And I think what I've been kind of interested in as well recently, as we spoke last time, is to be able to really help people as quickly as possible, and to offer them, the number of sessions that they are prepared to commit to therapy. And so in all my general practice now, I ask people how many sessions they are willing to commit themselves. And once you ask them that question, they don't say years, they say, 3 sessions or between 1 and 4. And so I think that also guides my thinking. So yeah, those are the kind of, mixture of the specific and the general.
really interesting. Now, there you mentioned pluralistic therapy.
Yeah.
In your view, what's the main difference between pluralism and integrative approaches to therapy?
Well, I think in a way at heart, they are sort of similar in a way that basically the idea of actually you need to modify your approach to actually to the person who's in front of you. But I think they differ in the sense that in pluralism, there's much more of an emphasis on the client directing the process, which I like. You know, I mean, I think that's important, and the idea that you know, take a both and approach rather than an either or approach to, you know, to things. And you know, I think there's a book. I don't know if you'll be, you know, interviewing Nick Cooper, but he and John Norcross did an important book called Personalizing Psychotherapy, which I think is basically kind of centered around client preferences. I don't think they actually spent much time asking clients about how long therapy should take, but rather what, you know, what they're looking for from therapy. And it's interesting in books like that, it tends to ignore the fact that, you know, as I've said in our last interview, that the mode or number of sessions that people have across the world is 1, followed by 2, followed by 3. And now that's you know, we need to be appraised about that. We can't afford to ignore it. And so, so I think that, you know, although we're going to be talking about REBT today, I think it's important for me to say that I embed that in a much broader view of psychotherapy and the human change process, and also how to, you know, the stance that you take towards people. I mean, I just kind of, you know, read a blog that one of my CBT colleagues that I knew years ago takes, and he's talking about the fact that in IAPT, he's quite critical of IAPT, and he's talking about, you know, that all the decisions that are made about the patient are made by therapists and the teams. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, yeah, but what about the client? You know, the client is central to the process. It's not, you know, the client is not somebody to kind of follow the professional's lead. At the very least, we should be active co-creators of therapy. But I think, you know, the client should point the way. You know, I'm a firm believer in that. The client should point the way, and I think the therapist should follow that, unless the therapist thinks that following that lead is going to be, you know, detrimental to the client, in which case they need to have an open and honest discussion about that. I'm not necessarily advocating that you go along with everything the client says, because you've got a voice and you've got an opinion and you need to sort of, you know, engage the client in that kind of discussion. But to not, if somebody comes for help, what do they want to, you know, what do they want to leave with at the end of the session? Is something that I think is such an important question to ask people.
Just a quick break here to tell you about an exciting new membership we're developing, and then we'll get right back to the show. This gets you access to our mastered library of over 5 years of psychology conferences, including over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, unlimited CPD certification, transcripts, quizzes, premium passes for our annual conference, online courses with Richard Schwartz and Deb Dana, and more. The cost is £97 for 1 year, which breaks down at around 27p per day. The best bit is you can try it out for 30 days completely risk-free, as all orders come with a 100% money-back guarantee. If you're interested, please go to twmembers.com for more information.
Is it fair to say that your basic frame towards therapy then is that the therapist is an active co-creator of the therapy, but you're letting the client lead the way?
Yes, but also that each therapist has got their own view, which I think they need to bring and be open about. And so I often say to people, are you interested in, I mean, it depends on the context. So for example, straight after this, I'm going to be doing a demonstration for the Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy Facebook group, right? Okay. And so guess what? I'm going to be doing REBT on that. Why? Because that's what I've been asked to do, you know? And so, you know, if you're going to agree to do something, then, you know, step up to the plate and do it. But in other arenas, I might say to somebody, are you interested in my take on the subject? And then I'll outline kind of basically an REBT view of it, which if it makes sense to the person, we use it. And if it doesn't make sense to the person, we don't.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So as you've taken this general and specific approach, and you've explored many different sort of modalities of therapy, it seems that you've dedicated a lot of time to writing books on REBT, and that seems to be the one that you've sort of aimed towards mastery in almost. So I'm just curious, why did you decide on REBT versus other forms, and what are the benefits of REBT versus other forms of psychotherapy as you see them?
Well, in order for me to answer that, I'll have to take you back on a little journey back to the day when Professor Dryden wasn't Professor Dryden and he had a head of hair. And so I got into the field when I was 24. I trained on a full-time course in client-centered therapy. This is before person-centered therapy was even thought about. So it was client-centered therapy. And I like the theory of client-centered therapy, although I thought it was a bit, it's got a great theory about the self. I think it doesn't really have much to say about, when people's problems don't relate to, their self-worth and those things. But I like the theory. I just didn't like the practice. I just thought it didn't really fit. And so I experimented with a psychodynamic course, and I was even less enamored with that. And then I kind of, got in, because we actually studied other approaches, and I resonated most with REBT. Now, I think this is an interesting point now. I think having said that, we should be giving ourselves to, really prioritizing the client, I think we also have to recognize that in this business, we're not just applying theories and techniques, because we are people. Therapists are people. And I think that unlike medicine, where I think it's much more of a technical, yes, it's important that, doctors have a good kind of bedside manner and all the rest of it, not knocking that. But I think it does matter, what therapists bring to it. And so I resonated with REBT, both according to the model of human disturbance and health that it articulated, and its fairly active directive approach to actually engaging people in conversation. And so when you last asked me to nominate 3 books that I would recommend, one of them was called Embodied Theory. And the reason I recommended that is because that book looks at the importance of the therapist really living a life that is underpinned by some of the ideas that inform their practice. And so I don't want to be the kind of person that believes one thing outside of the therapy room and something else inside of the therapy room. So a number of years ago, when CBT became popular, and jobs in CBT were more popular than other posts for other approaches. You had people like psychodynamic therapists wanted to train in CBT. Did that mean they had a sudden conversion to the model? No. What it meant was they needed to earn a living, and they couldn't really do that unless they actually kind of retrained in that. So I'm glad I never had to do that. I'm glad that in a way that I could actually approach the business of doing therapy from a position of being authentic and being transparent to clients about what I'm offering them. So there was a very close resonance between myself and REBT, and that's what drew me, to it. Doesn't mean that I haven't drawn upon other approaches, but the reason I call REBT is a good example of what I call theoretically consistent eclecticism, is that you're borrowing from approaches, but you're doing it in the service of this particular approach. But also you're flexible enough to lay aside that in the service of the client.
Got you. So for somebody that is, in their very early stages of their career as a therapist, do you think it's important to go through a period of exploration to see which type of approach sort of resonates with you most, and then maybe get into that?
Yes, I definitely do. And I think that's why, although I valued the kind of grounding that my initial training in client-centered therapy had, because I think it's a good discipline in kind of listening, understanding the client from the client's frame of reference, communicating your understanding of what they're saying. All these are good basic counseling skills. Now, I know that person-centered therapy is a lot more than that, but I think we learned some good basic counseling skills. And I always recommend that people always start off with a good grounding in basic, counseling skills. One of I supervise an REBT colleague of mine, and he's a lovely chap. And he knows his REBT, but he has lacked that grounding in basic counseling skills. So I've said to him, go off and get that grounding, and to give him his due, because he's open-minded. He's taken that and he's actually gone off to do that. So, I think that you get that grounding, but you also need to see what's out there, right? To actually read around and to see what's out there. And so I was lucky enough to be a student of Richard Nelson Jones, who ran the Aston counseling course, and he wrote an excellent book called The Theory and Practice of Counseling and Psychotherapy. And the lectures that he gave his book began life as the lectures that he gave his students. And so we had a good introduction to REBT, to psychodynamic. Cognitive behavior therapy really wasn't, it was just, Beck's first book, his 1976 book, hadn't come out yet. So, that wasn't something that we studied because it hadn't been created yet. It'd been created, but it hadn't been, certainly in Britain. And Gestalt therapy, transaction analysis, we had a good grounding in that. And so I was able to actually kind of determine that person-centered therapy, unlike my good friend and late colleague Pete Sanders, who you may know, who went on to create PCCS books. He's a lifelong person-centered therapist. It's in his bones, and that's not for me, because I'm not Pete. And so I felt that I was giving a pale imitation of being a client-centered therapist, whereas he was the real deal. And so he would struggle practicing REBT. I struggled practicing person-centered therapy. So I think there is that added dimension in our work, which other other approaches don't seem to have, the importance of what the person holds dear and can say, I put this into practice in my own life. I think that's really important. If you're going to be advocating something, practice what you preach.
100%. If it makes sense that if you're going to be doing something every day and trying to help people improve their quality of life with a certain approach, that you better really believe in it, and you better really, yeah, it needs to fit, you know. So next question, Wendy, how, for someone who's never heard of REBT before, and this is a complete introduction, how would you explain it to them? Like, how would you explain this to a 10-year-old, for example, if you had to?
A 10-year-old?
Yes.
Well, there's a challenge. That's kind of difficult to explain to a 10-year-old about. Well, I mean, first of all, I'd make the point to the 10-year-old in some way that it's not what happens to you that is the main thing that determines your feelings, but how you think about it. I mean, I wouldn't use words like attitudes necessarily, or beliefs to a 10-year-old. So I'd make that point, and then take it from there. But if I was explaining it to somebody a little bit more advanced in years, I would make the point, as I often do, is that we start off as human beings with desires and preferences. We all have a sense of what's important to us, and that's what makes us human. What's important to you, Niall, is different from what's important to me, and so we need to recognize what's our desires, our preferences, what's important to us. And that's not the problem. It's what happens when the world does not give us what's important to us. It's then how do we respond to that? And what Ellis says is that you can either take what's important to you and your desires, and you can make them rigid and extreme, or keep them flexible and non-extreme. And so, you presumably, it matters to you that the weekend university is a success, and that's going to kind of guide your efforts. But I think it's important, for you to deal with what happens if it's not a success. Are you gonna take a flexible mindset as I increase it? People seem to resonate with the idea of mindset these days rather than beliefs and attitudes, and I believe in sort of putting things that people can readily respond to. It makes a difference between whether you take a flexible mindset to adversity, and adversity really means this is an event where you are not getting what you want, or that you're getting what you don't want, right? It could be a minor event, or it could be a major event. And so what REBT says is that if you can hold to a flexible mindset in the face of that adversity, it then gives you a lot of room to maneuver in terms of what to do, how to think, how to step back. You're rolling with the punches. If you're rigid, you're kind of you've got a sort of fixed mindset, your tunnel vision, your behavior gets sort of stereotyped. You can't think clearly, and there's a tendency to keep on doing the same things over and over again. So I think that's why I like REBT, because it's really advocating something which I think is a guiding principle, which is associated with mental health. And I think in some ways, Stephen Hayes says this in different ways with his approach to acceptance and commitment therapy, and that is flexibility of mindset, of attitude, and then that will lead you to be flexible in terms of your behavior. And so REBT is saying the more flexible you are, then the more relative you are in terms of the evaluations that you make of yourself, other people, and the world, and the more you'll be able to navigate these adversities that life, rightly or wrongly, gives us. And so, the thing I like about REBT is saying, well, look, let's not talk too much about whether, this person likes you or not, you know, let's not necessarily spend much time looking at the evidence, whether they like you or not, till afterwards. Let's assume temporarily that the person doesn't like you. Now, how are you going to deal with that? It's possible that they don't going to like you, you know. And I think that in a way, one of the things that we need to do in this world, and I think that there's some sort of illustrations of education, which is troubling, not to me but a lot of people, which is, you know, we have to protect people from adversity in case they get upset, you know. And I say, don't do that, because you're not encouraging them to be psychologically resilient. You know, I'm not suggesting that you kind of deliberately, you know, sort of introduce adversity just for that purpose. So in REBT, we say, well, let's suppose that this person doesn't like you. Let's suppose that the weekend university is going to fall flat on its face. Let's suppose that the next time, you know, you go to the doctor, Professor Dryden, they say, I'm awfully sorry, but you're terminally ill. Let's suppose that. Now, how are we all going to deal with those adversities? You know, and then once we've got that in our sort of repertoire, we're then able, I think, to look more clearly at the world and assess the likelihood of the weekend university, you know, going you know, to greater heights or disappearing. You know, to what extent you know, how I'm going to kind of live my life, you know, in the few years that I might have after this sort of terminal illness, or in fact, maybe I'll be able to kind of do things to surprise the doctors. After all, you know, people do. So, you know, it gives you a greater degrees of freedom in which to live your life. And I'm all about helping people to kind of, you know, to expand their lives rather than contract them.
Really interesting. It reminds me of a couple of things. There's a quote from Eckhart Tolle. It's like, whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it. And then another thing I've heard, we interviewed Stephen Hayes a couple of years ago on psychological flexibility. And the big thing I took away from Stephen's work is just to have a basic orientation to life, to just to love what is, you know, whatever's happening, just try and love it, you know.
Well, you see, this is where I'm going to depart from two people who are far more wise and well known, you know, than I am, because you know, if somebody tells me that I'm going to die in 2 years' time, right? I'm going to love that. I'm going to hate it, and I don't think there's anything wrong with hating it. You know, I'm going to accept it, because for me, acceptance means that is the reality. But accepting it, you know, includes for me that is the reality, and I really don't like it, and I really wish it was different. So, and so I would also disagree with Eckhart Tolle that, you know, okay, in the moment, you know, there are certain moments that, you know, you should definitely love, or certain moments you should definitely hate. You know, when I was many years ago after my bar mitzvah in the synagogue, when I was saying a speech in English and I was stammering like there's no tomorrow, in that moment I hated it. I don't want to embrace. I don't think it's great to embrace that. You're lying to yourself if you do that. And I'm not a great believer in encouraging people to lie to themselves. So if something is an adversity and you really don't like it, there's nothing wrong with really not liking it, you know. And I'm not an embracer of adversity. I'm an acceptor of adversity, but not an embracer of adversity.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so next question, Wendy. What would you say the foundational principles that REBT is built upon? And maybe if you could start here with telling us about the ABC framework.
Well, the ABC framework is, you know, you can look at it as a simple framework, or if you go into it in any great depth, you can it's actually quite a complicated framework. But simply speaking, you know, as we go along in life, as I say, we have our preferences, and something happens which goes against our preferences, and these are adversities, you know, and there are a whole host of adversities in life. And as Aaron Beck outlined in his 1976 book, Cognitive Therapy and the Emotional Disorders, which I still recommend that people read. I think it's a fantastic book, because what it showed there is the kind of adversities that lead to different emotions. So you've got threat, you know, something happens to you. And I like the idea of, again, that Beck came up with, which is the personal domain. That is the domain that which includes things that we hold dear. Each person's personal domain is unique. You know, if you had a twin brother, your twin brother and your identical twin, likely there's going to be overlap in your personal domain, but also likely there's going to be uniqueness. You may look the same, but certain things, you know, will be different. And so what Beck says is that we have a personal domain, and certain things can happen that could threaten it. And when we, and so threat is an important adversity at A. Loss and failure and unfair plight are adversities that are associated with depression. Transgression of a moral code of one's own is associated with guilt, and in another person, transgression of a personal code is going to be related to anger. And what I think what I like about REBT is really saying these adversities on their own only put you into the zone of experiencing negative emotions. And so it's healthy to feel sad if you've lost something. It's healthy to be concerned if you feel under threat. It's healthy to feel remorseful if you've broken a moral code. But, you know, the unhealthy negative emotions, and this is why, again, I think one of the REBT ideas that I like, the difference between constructive or healthy negative emotions and unhealthy negative emotions, argues that the rigid and extreme attitudes that you have towards adversity leads you into the business of experiencing unhealthy negative emotions and the behavior and type of thinking that goes along with that. And the flexible and non-extreme attitudes that you hold towards the same adversities lead you to feel healthy negative emotions. So REBT is basically often, you know, saying to people, you know, and I do that to sometimes get people's attention. I say, well, I can help you to feel badly about this. And they look at me and say, well, I'm already feel badly about this. I said, no, you've got the kind of badness that leads to disturbance and leads you to kind of, you know, to self-defeat. I'm going to help you to feel healthily bad about that. We don't have, in general, a concept of to feel bad but healthy. And this is one of the things that I find that I often introduce to people, and they've often never even thought about it. So the ABC is adversity times rigid and extreme attitudes leads to emotional disturbance. The same adversity plus flexible and non-extreme attitudes leads to emotional dissatisfaction. If I can make a distinction between dissatisfaction and disturbance to indicate the distinction between healthy and negative, healthy and unhealthy negative emotions. And I think that, you know, REBT is, you know, because it does have this sort of viewpoint of, you know, rigid versus, you know, there's not, you know, you're either rigid or you're flexible. You know, there's not, people say, isn't it a continuum? And I say, no, it's not, because at the very time, if you're rigid, it's very difficult to be flexible, and when you're flexible, you know, you're not going to be rigid. So they are different, and to actually help people to see that flexible mindset is something that they can develop in the same way as they can develop other skills, because they need to practice it. They need to, rather than hide away from adversity, they need to approach it if that's not, you know, self-defeating for them to do that. In the same way, I mean, again, even before I even got interested in therapy, I developed this fear of Alsatians because I was bitten when I was a youngster, and then I found myself every time I saw an Alsatian getting anxious and moving across the road, and I thought about this for a minute, and for a while I thought, no, this is not going to help me. Next time I see an Alsatian, even though I'm frightened, I'm going to approach it and try to make friends with it if I can, or at least, and so that's what I did. And, I very soon lost my fear. And that taught me an important thing, that even though that you are fearful, you can still take action. That's not a new thing. Do I like Alsatians? Not particularly. Am I afraid of them? No. Because after a while, what you learn is that if you were attacked by one Alsatian and then you meet 100 Alsatians that didn't attack you, you change your inferences. And so that was another thing that I actually kind of, learned. So again, I realized at the time, when I was much younger, that I was actually putting into practice REBT type ideas. And that's why I say I kind of, looking back, I resonated with that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so this is really interesting. Now, I don't know if I'm getting this right or not, right? I'm just going to throw this out there. So the model is basically the A is adverse, like an adverse situation, and then the B is that for beliefs? And
well, yes. See, Ellis called it beliefs because it started with a B. I call it, in order to preserve the B, I call it basic attitudes, because it's B, and the attitudes are at the base or at the foundation of people's response. So for me, A is adversity, B are the basic attitudes that you can hold towards the adversity, either rigid and extreme or flexible and non-extreme, and C are the consequences, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive consequences of each of those different kind of basic attitudes.
So it seems that our default view for most of us is that it's, without thinking about it, it's more just A to C, and there's less of the B.
Oh yeah. We, in fact, one of the first assignments I used to give my master's students is to watch soap operas and make a note of AC language. You piss me off. You're scaring me. That kind of thing. And so, we and this whole business of it's a whole different ballgame. I don't particularly want to get into it now, but the whole business of trauma these days. What is trauma? Is it an adversity? Is it response? Is it a way of processing information? Is it all of those three? It's kind of difficult. But if we leave that alone, just for the time being, the idea to actually have people to take responsibility without blaming themselves for holding the attitudes that are related. And I often say that, okay, yes, it's your attitude, but that's good news, because you can always change your attitude. You can't always change adversity. If adversity really does make you disturbed, then the only way you can not be disturbed is to change the adversity or remove yourself from the adversity. And that's no way to live a life.
100%.
Now, unless the adversity is violence, domestic abuse, etc. I'm not suggesting that you should stay and put up with that, but I am suggesting that we need to train our children, I think, to actually not to recognize that they can face adversity, and they can be helped to face adversity and to feel badly when adversity comes. We don't need to protect children from feeling bad. It's part of living life.
So then, is the goal of REBT essentially to help people see that there is a B between the A and C, and then focus on increasing the flexibility of the B so that they're more fluid with life and they're less rigid.
Ideally, if people are interested in that, and again, I do kind of, relate to what I said much earlier on. I'm interested in what people are interested in. I'm not necessarily interested in selling, something which I think is important to them that they think is, doesn't really hold much of a difference. But I think, for me, if I can actually help people to leave a session or to leave a number of sessions, really saying, okay, then I can see that I'm going to work toward becoming more flexible in my mindset, and learn to take the horror out of events, learn to accept myself, others, and the world, and learn to tolerate or learn to bear things which I previously thought were unbearable. Then I think, those are real good skills: flexibility of mindset, taking the horror out of things, kind of bearing what you thought was unbearable, and accepting other people, yourself, and the world. If you did that and really, and listen, this is a work in progress. This is not something that you can easily after one session get, but it is something that you can work towards. And we're going to struggle with it. Why? Because we're human. If we had a rational robot, we could take out the rigid mindset and put in the flexible mindset, and that'd be it. But human beings don't work that way.
100%. So I'd maybe like to just maybe dive a bit deeper into this aspect of REBT. And you call them basic attitudes, but how might a therapist identify or help to identify a client's basic attitudes that are causing them difficulty in life? Like, how might they identify the places where the rigidity exists?
Well, you use the causation word, and we're not saying that attitudes cause anything. What we're saying, and what Ellis said right at the beginning of the idea, is that things interact. So our beliefs about or our attitudes towards events interact with our tendencies to act and think and feel in a certain way. And so often changing attitudes, you can work towards changing attitudes, or at least beginning that process, because you've got a choice between the rigid and the flexible, and you can actually think about that, stand back and engage your mind in actually that particular way of actually looking at it. But I think what we do have a structure, and that we often start with a specific instance of a person's problem, and we look at their emotions first, and then we find out what the person was most disturbed about. So we start off with the emotional C, and then we look for the A, and then when we've got that, our job is to help people to see that they have choices in terms of what attitudes that they have, and which attitude does underpin their response. So and this is what I do every week at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday for the REBT Facebook group. I do half-an-hour demonstration sessions where I'm doing just that. And so once you've got that, you can then help people to see what they can do to actually develop a more flexible and less extreme mindset, how they can actually put that into practice, and how they can then generalize that learning to other areas of their life. Because these attitudes are really important for life, not just for Christmas, so to speak.
100%. So you're essentially, you identify to figure it out, you identify the C, the disturbances, and then you link that with the adversity that is caused or that has led to those circumstances, and then you're trying to work on the B then, but between those two things.
Yeah, you help people to make a distinction between the flexible and non-extreme B and the rigid and extreme B, and ask them which one underpins their response and how would they feel if they really believe the other one, right? And people can see that if they really believed that one, the flexible and non-extreme mindset, then they would be much better off. And so I say, would you like me to help you to actually, develop that? See, and of course, people have got objections. People say, oh, I need my rigidity. If I don't have my rigidity, if I don't believe I have to get up in the morning, I wouldn't get up. Well, then you've got a whole host of doubts, reservations, and objections that a good REBT therapist would be able to kind of help you to work towards. That your musts are based on your desires, and it's your desires that get you up, and it's your musts that often lead you back to bed rather than get you up. So yeah, I mean, it's and it's quite, the therapist is quite active, and this is why I think initially, I think at the time when Ellis was actually developing his ideas, therapists were much more inactive and quiet, and so it was quite shocking when he came along and found that he was talking quite a lot at the beginning, because there's an educative aspect of REBT, but I think now, in modern psychotherapy, as one of my colleagues put it, it's much more conversational, where both parties are active. And now I think clients really struggle to make sense when therapists are silent and inactive, unless they have a way of understanding that. They find that quite disconcerting. And you could never accuse Albert Ellis of being quiet and inactive in therapy. You can accuse him of a lot of things, but being quiet and inactive in therapy, you can't.
100%. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes left, Wendy, and there's 3 questions that I really want to ask you. And if I don't get to ask you them all, I'm going to be a bit gutted. So I'm going to ask you them all at once, and hopefully you can get through them. All right.
Yeah.
So the first thing is here, this seems to revolve around helping clients to change their basic attitudes. So what have you found most effective for doing that in therapy? What strategies can people do to actually, what practical things can people do to change that? The second thing is, what basic attitudes towards life have best served you over the years? What have you found most beneficial in your own life, your own work, just to keep in mind? And then the final thing is, if you could plant a belief or a basic attitude in the mind of everybody on the planet, what would it be?
Well, I'll take the last thing first, and that is to think for yourself. Don't listen to anybody without really thinking for yourself, even if their name is Windy Dryden. Think for yourself. I'll definitely plant that. The first one, well, actually, let's have a look at the second one first. I think that at different times in my life, I've benefited from taking the horror out of experience. I've certainly been able to kind of, being able to tolerate and persist at various things. At one point in my life, when I left my job at Aston University, I took voluntary redundancy. I didn't get another job until the 55th job applications. And I often say that I received 54 job rejections and 0 self-rejections. So I think self-acceptance was definitely helpful to me there. And the willingness to persist and keep going. I think I'm a great believer. And learning along the way, I'm not suggesting you do the same thing over and over again, but kind of persist and learn along the way. So what was the first one again, Neil? No?
Strategies for changing basic attitudes. What have you found most effective?
Well, as a way of opening up the discussion with people, I asked them to take the 2 attitudes that they've got the rigid and extreme and the flexible and the non-extreme. And I say, okay, it's your responsibility to teach a group of children, maybe your own, maybe children that you know, which one of those would you teach? Would you teach the children to be flexible and non-extreme in their attitudes towards adversity, or would you teach them to be rigid? Would you teach people to be rigid, to view adversity as horror, to believe that certain things are unbearable, and to hate themselves, other people, and the world along the way? Or would you teach them to be flexible in their attitudes, to be kind of relative in their appraisals of badness, to tolerate difficulties, and to accept themselves and other people and the world along the way? People are not stupid. Of course they're going to say that. That's fine. Now the door is open. Now you can have a discussion with them about, okay, would you like to be able to do that for yourself? And how would you stop yourself from doing that? And you're off and running.
Brilliant. I love that. Love that. Okay. So I think that's pretty much all I've got time for. You've got another REBT session on now with your Facebook group. So we'll let you go. Before you go, for anybody that wants to learn more about your work, your books, your trainings, how can they find you online? And
well, if they want to learn about REBT, I recommend that they go on the Albert Ellis Institute website, where I'm a core faculty member of the Albert Ellis Institute, and so I would recommend that they go and go on that website. If they want to see REBT in action, they should join the REBT Facebook group. And I have a book of transcripts of some of those sessions, and it's called REBT Live, which you can get on Amazon. And so any of those things I think are useful. But I really would suggest that people would be wise to go back to one of the other books that I recommended, when you asked me to write the three, and that is Reason and Emotion in Psychotherapy. And if you can get hold of the first edition, which came out in 1962, that is the one that excited me about REBT, and I do recommend that people have a look at that.
Fantastic. Okay, Wendy, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today and learn from you. And I just want to say thank you for all the great work that you're doing and the contribution you're making to your writing, your teaching, and everything. It's incredible. So thank you. I'll let you go, and I wish you the best of luck going forward.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our master library of over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, as well as transcripts, CPD certification, quizzes, and unlimited access to the recordings from our annual conferences. For more information, please go to theweekenduniversity.com/membership.